Okay, so today's going to be a little bit different than usual. I've had this on my mind for a little while now, and something popped into my feed today that really struck a chord with me. So I want to talk about that, and I think it might make some people mad because what I want to do is that I want to pose a question about PlayStation and whether or not they've lost some of what made them so special. Maybe they lost their identity. Now, I do want to preface my thoughts ahead of time because I do like PlayStation. I don't want you to come in here and take this out of context. I like the PS5 and a lot of the exclusives that they've gotten this generation. I've enjoyed games like Horizon Forbidden West and God of War Ragnarok. In fact, I'm about ready to play Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. A lot of you are probably well aware that I've been extremely excited for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. But my question about PlayStation is more about their first-party philosophy. Now, for a lot of people, their favorite PlayStation console might be the PlayStation 1, maybe it's the PlayStation 2, or who knows, maybe even the PlayStation 4. For me, though, the console that really grabbed me personally was the PlayStation 3. Yeah, this was their worst performing home console, so why in the world is this the generation that I gravitate towards the most? And it really just all boils down to Sony hunkering down and really cementing their first-party philosophy. This was at a time when PlayStation wasn't dominant. You all have often heard me say this, and it's something that I truly do believe in. Competition breeds excellence, and I think the PS3 generation is a perfect example of that. The Xbox 360 was performing very well at this time, and it was really actually ahead throughout most of that generation. Then you had the Nintendo Wii, and while that was a very different console, it was a phenomenon at that time. So Sony was kind of fighting from behind. They really had to prove themselves during the PS3 era. They had to fight and claw to prove themselves that generation, and I honestly feel like it made them better. They came out of that generation showing without a shadow of doubt that their exclusives are industry leading. And that's what really separates them from the competition. See, to this day, when you see that PlayStation logo, you immediately believe that it will be of the utmost high quality. But here's where it was so special for me during the PS3 generation. PlayStation led in a very different way back then than how they do now. Back then, they had a diverse lineup that really mixed in all kinds of different genres and formats. They had big blockbusters like Uncharted, you had Killzone, you had The Last of Us. They had creative smaller games like Mod Nation Racers, Little Big Planet, and Puppeteer. They had mascot games like Sly Cooper and Ratchet & Clank. They experimented with different genres like Infamous, and they also had gritty first-person shooters, such as Resistance. They were at the top of their game when it comes to creativity, and every single time, you expected that high quality. Now, fast forward to today, though. PlayStation, yes, still absolutely makes great games. There's no doubt about that. But there is a key difference in how they operate, and that all boils down to creativity and diversity. If you noticed anything about the PS3 games that I just mentioned, you'll recognize that they're from all kinds of different genres and they all have different budgets. They weren't afraid to take chances or to sell games that might be a little bit smaller. And that's what really inspired this video. I ran across this video today where the former PlayStation boss, Sean Layden, said this back at E3, I believe in 2014. Check out what he said.
A little earlier, I was delighted to hear Andy give a shout out to one of the most iconic games of our time, Vib Ribbon. Yeah, give it up for Vib Ribbon. A personal favorite of mine that really embodies the PlayStation spirit. It wasn't a multi-million seller, but that's not the point. Vib Ribbon was unafraid to go against the tide. It was courageous in its ambition, and it brought a completely new experience to gamers. It's an incredible time to be part of the PlayStation family. I look forward to growing our gaming community through breakthrough experiences that inspire and delight. After all, guys, it's all about the games, isn't it?
Again, he said, and I quote, "It wasn't a multi-million seller, but that's not the point. It brought a completely new experience to gamers. After all, it's about the games." When you hear that, this almost comes off as a contrast to how PlayStation operates today, where primarily they focus on story-driven cinematic blockbusters, usually in an over-the-shoulder third-person view. Now, the gameplay for a lot of these games are quite different from one another. God of War doesn't play like Spider-Man, and Spider-Man doesn't play like Horizon. But it is a format that they have kind of stuck to. And that's increasingly been the case ever since the debut of Uncharted. Now, before we even continue, a lot of you are probably aware that Uncharted is one of my favorite series ever made. I love and adore this series. But at the same time, I do also recognize that it kind of changed PlayStation, for better or worse. I think this quote from Linkin Park kind of describes what I'm trying to say here. In one of their songs, they say, "Even a blueprint is a gift and a curse, because once you got a theory of how the thing works, everybody wants the next thing to be just like the first." So what that means is that we often fall into this trap where we push creativity to the side and instead demand the same thing over and over and over again. In this case, Sony has a blueprint that clearly has worked for them in the past, and it's something that they don't really often stray away from anymore. And that's why we don't really see that same creativity that we saw back during the PS3 generation, or really even during the PS4 years. I mean, if you look at the PS4, we still got a pretty good mix of games back then, but now it really just kind of feels like they've fully shifted over to this more AAA blockbuster approach. And anything else is just kind of rare to see. It's one of the reasons I just never really cared for Jim Ryan's approach. His approach just kind of seems like it's blockbuster or bust. And if it's not a blockbuster, it's a live service game. So I just thought Sean Layden did worlds better. And that's why I always criticized Jim Ryan. I just was not a fan of his approach to gaming. Like, it's good to have these big AAA games. Don't get me wrong. Those are your system sellers. But at the same time, don't necessarily completely shut out those smaller creative games as well. And, something else that I've kind of been thinking about as well. I've heard gaming figures talk about kids and how they're growing up with phones instead of gaming consoles. But I don't really think the game industry is necessarily doing enough to bring in those kids and grow alongside them for future generations. I mean, when I grew up in the 90s, back then, PlayStation, Nintendo, and Sega were all putting out games that kids would enjoy. And a lot of those kids, like myself, are still playing consoles to this day. I mean, I think that's something that we often forget about. Gaming's not just about people of our age. It's not just about you and me. It's also about that younger audience as well. And it's important that we get that audience involved, because if you want core gaming to be here 20 years from now, you're going to want that younger audience interested. A lot of people who play these core games today started off when they were kids. That's where it all began for a lot of gamers. And I feel like this is something that we don't grow enough in the modern era of gaming. I mean, looking at the console makers, I feel like Nintendo is really the only one that truly does that with consistency, which means that in 20 years from now, the kids that are playing the Nintendo Switch today will have affinity with Nintendo in the future. And then they'll introduce their kids to Nintendo games as well. But you don't really see that from these other console makers as much. I mean, to be fair, PlayStation does have a few games like Astro's Playroom. I love that game. Ratchet & Clank as well, and even Sackboy. But there's not really a lot of consistency, is what I'm trying to say. I think more could be done there. But I don't know. Like I said, I enjoy the PlayStation 5. I like their big blockbuster games. Don't take what I've said out of context. But I think with the ballooning budgets and how expensive these big AAA games are to make, it just kind of opens your eyes, and it just makes me appreciate these past generations even more. Because I look at something like Spider-Man 2. It cost them $300+ million to make that game. But looking back at it, I didn't enjoy that game more than the first one. In reality, I actually enjoyed Spider-Man 1 more than a sequel. So did that increased budget actually do anything for me as a consumer? Did it increase my enjoyment? Did it make a better game? Because I think that's debatable. What makes this situation even worse is the increased development time. That does go hand in hand with these out-of-control budgets. And it's crazy to me that we got 3 Uncharted games back on the PlayStation 3. Plus, we also got The Last of Us. The PlayStation 5, on the other hand, we'll be lucky to get one single new Naughty Dog game. And who knows if that game will even live up to the quality of those previous PS3 titles that I just mentioned. Those sparkly new graphics and animations, all that motion capture, and all the different technology that they're putting into these games, that doesn't mean that it'll actually be a better game. It does not mean that I'm suddenly going to get this infinite amount of extra enjoyment just because of all of the extra things that they're adding. You still have to combine all of that with fun gameplay and good storytelling. I don't know, though. I'm probably all over the place by this point. I'm just kind of letting my thoughts roll out, so I'll just go ahead and wrap this video up. But it is something that I've been thinking about a lot here recently, and I want to hear y'all's thoughts on it. Do you think PlayStation has lost some of what's made them special in those previous generations, or do you prefer their new approach with the PS5? I mean, you might like their new business practice more, and hey, that's perfectly okay. It's only opinions at the end of the day, and I'm never going to try to force somebody to feel exactly how I do. So let me hear your thoughts in the comments below, but till next time, peace out.